Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Sergio Perez responds emphatically to being back on the F1 grid next year with Cadillac, throwing some shades the way of the Red Bull team that dropped him last year, and in some respects at the drivers that ended up replacing him, saying that he's got nothing left to prove in F1 based on this result. Does that mean that he's here at Cadillac for the paycheck, or does he have some serious championship ambitions in mind? What's going to happen over the coming months? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Let's crack on because there's lots to say. Starting here with McLaren. They were, I believe, the only team not to have a title sponsor. It was the case with Williams, but then they've got their one, and McLaren were, I think, the only team still to just be McLaren Formula 1 team. Now they're no longer just McLaren Formula 1 team. They are going to be McLaren Mastercard Formula 1 team. Here we go again. From 2026 onwards, they will be their official title sponsor, their official naming partner, or whatever they describe them as. They did a little announcement here with some of the McLaren guys, the drivers, Zach Brown, talking about this. I'm sure it's going to be a sensational partnership. It was just announced in Amsterdam. Now, The Athletic did a piece on this, and they said that this deal is apparently worth $100 million. So I think the article was titled something like, "Why did McLaren finally say yes to a title sponsor?" Well, I wonder why. It's because of the amount of zeros at the end of the contract. We think that Petronas with Mercedes, and of course Oracle with Red Bull, and I'm sure Aramco with Aston Martin, those are particularly lucrative deals. This is, if not the biggest in F1, it's certainly close to it, and it's certainly the biggest in the history of McLaren. So look, it makes sense. I know that McLaren fans and elsewhere will probably think, did it have to be this way? But it has to be this way. It just is what it is. I mean, when you're getting offered $100 million a season, then it's kind of difficult to say no. Zach Brown deserves a lot of credit. You just got to say it, right? Because it wasn't that long ago when the McLaren looked like this, with not all that many sponsors on it at all. Fast forward a few years, and everyone is trying to get their logo on that McLaren car, not least Mastercard, as we have just seen unfold. That's the McLaren update of the day. Let's talk about 2026, because a few interesting updates there. Toto Wolff makes it clear this year's Mercedes isn't going anywhere in terms of further upgrades. They think they have a platform to work with. They've said that from the start of the season. But as Toto says, it'll be an intense 10 races as we work on this year, but also simultaneously for 2026 as well. Now, speaking of 26, they are making changes all the time to these regulations behind the scenes. Not in terms of what the car is going to look like and the aero regs or necessarily the engine regs, but more so how they are going to operate. Now, you might argue, and well, we'll see in the article here, there's actually a poll that they do on AMUS discussing whether F1 has gone too far with this, whether we should wait and see. The bottom line is the horsepower used to be 163 horsepower from the electrical part, 120 kilowatts. For next season, it's now 350 kilowatts, or near enough 500 horsepower. Now, the ICE still contributes a little bit more, but when the electrical deployment is at full whack, that car is well over 1,100 horsepower, and the cars are more powerful at top speed, basically, than they will be today. So the teams and the governing body are desperately trying to figure out what they do to manage this situation, because one of the issues that the teams have realized is because they've got so much electrical deployment with an insane amount of torque delivery that these cars will be accelerating like a rocket. And in Monte Carlo, in the tunnel, currently, the cars get to maybe 290 kph, which is very fast. It's not a huge acceleration zone into the tunnel at Monaco, as we know. They've also got heavy downforce on the car to help them at low speed, but certainly hinder them when they try and get to those top speeds. But the current cars do about 290 kph coming out of the tunnel. That is quick. The new cars next year will be doing another 60 kph on top of that. 350 kph is, near enough the top speeds we get to nowadays in like Monza. The idea of doing that out of the tunnel in Monaco sounds pretty scary because they're able to accelerate so rapidly with all of that deployment. And on some tracks, Toto thinks they could be able to get to 400 kph. So they're not going to change the rules precisely. They're not going to change the engines. What they are going to do is change the way the energy can be deployed, because the argument is that around a circuit like Singapore, around a circuit like Monaco, if you can use all of your electrical engine, it's going to be too much. It's just going to not be safe anymore. And that's understandable, right? And there's also the concern, what if the guy in front of me drops his whole battery and then runs out of battery, whereas I'm still deploying all of mine? My overspeed is going to be insane. He's just going to become an obstacle in my way. And that could be dangerous. You don't want cars dramatically decelerating on a straight when they're not braking, right? That's a potential problem. So the FIA are trying to figure this out. They've got a few ideas for how they resolve it. Each of the 11 teams already currently has a status of how much energy can be used at each venue. The percentage of full throttle is determined, so we can see the numbers here. With 2 exceptions, full power may be deployed on each of the circuits. The only ones are Monaco and Singapore, where there's going to be a reduced power mode, which is going to be standard operation and in override mode, which we'll discuss override mode in a second. This was the poll. I voted for this option, which is that we've got to have a wait and see, but we are going to be turning up to like every Grand Prix next year, and it's going to be like, okay, there's a new technical directive and we're changing the rules in some very minor way to try and help with energy mapping and deployment and all this. And you're going to need a PhD in megajoules to figure out what's going on next year, because there's a lot to this, right? It's more complicated than in many respects it has ever been. The point is that on certain tracks, the very high speed tracks, we're talking Monza and stuff like this, they need other restrictions to prevent the car just dropping all of the battery at the start of the straight and then slowing dramatically. There are also restrictions on how much energy can be recovered per lap. Typically the limit is 9 megajoules according to the regulations, but on each normal race lap that becomes 8.5 on a race, but it's actually 9 in free practice, quali and override mode, and this includes tracks like Suzuka, Miami, Monaco, Spa, Madrid and Austin, but at other tracks that difference is changing, and in Jeddah the charging rate is even limited further, potentially because of some of the risks. So, you know, it's all going on, right? Then the point is around DRS, which is disappearing, but we know that the new mode is coming in, which is this override mode that they can deploy. Forget override mode for just a second. On a normal track, they are allowed to reduce the level of deployment from the battery by 100 kilowatts per second. So the point is they can't just dump it all and then it drops to 0. If they want to dump it, they have to reduce the power from 350 kilowatts down to, 250, 150, 50, 0 across a period of about 3.5 seconds. But at some tracks, they will instead make that ramp down takes 7 seconds. So on super fast tracks, Melbourne, Jeddah, Silverstone, Spa, Monza, Baku, Las Vegas, they will have to deploy over a maximum period of at least 7 seconds. So, it's a mess, isn't it, really? It is a bit of a mess, and well, maybe Melbourne should actually be 75 kilowatts per second. Maybe Las Vegas should actually be 40. I don't know. They're trying to make it like, okay, we've got the high-speed tracks and the non-high-speed tracks to keep it simple. There may be an argument that things need to get even more complicated, but they can activate this override mode to give them extra deployment, and they talk about here exactly how it's going to work. Currently, there is only one spot on the track where you can use it. So if you're within a second of the car in front, it's the same as DRS, you're going to be able to deploy an extra override mode to give you effectively push to pass kind of type thing, as is over there in IndyCar. But the distances only refer to the distance to the finish line, and the boost range is not equal to the current DRS zones. In fact, at the tracks right now, there's only one zone. So in Spa, the zone begins at the finish line. So if you're within 1 second there, then you can start to use it. But obviously the finish line is not the start of the straight. So do you have to use it immediately, or do you have the option to start to use it at some point after you're able to? Bahrain, it's the 4th straight, which doesn't currently have a DRS zone on the run down towards the end of the lap. Many tracks it's the home straight. Interlagos, the exit of turn 13. In Melbourne, it's the end of the back straight. So it's a mess. And these are the specifications for the MG UK power and everything, and we're seeing it gets reduced in Monaco. We're seeing it gets reduced in Singapore. And these are some of the other numbers. So anyway, there's your 2026 update of the day, if you can wrap your head around that. And as the FIA are saying, we have not finalised the rules yet. We're constantly iterating, and I expect that constant iteration to not change anytime soon. That it's going to get really techie. Next year begins, certain teams are going to be like, oh, well, I actually think for this track, the ramp down rate should be this for this reason. And they're going to say it because they think that advantages them. But what do the FIA think? And who really understands any of this stuff anyway? So intrigued your thoughts and a comment on that. The Dutch Grand Prix is coming up this weekend. Ferrari are optimistic that they can maybe continue some of their momentum. But let's talk about the driver market. We've seen a few things over the last few days, one of which was around Alex Palou. There were rumours potentially that Palou could be getting involved at Red Bull Racing, but Chip Ganassi have basically, that's the team that he races for, I've said, look, that ain't gonna happen. He is not going anywhere anytime soon. We'll see if that comes to anything. There were rumours that are starting to continue on whether Colton Herta could give it a run in Formula 2. There have been rumours circulating around this. He was maybe going to get the Racing Bulls or AlphaTauri as it was an opportunity a couple of years ago, but not getting the super license points. Still a driver who's kind of exciting, but right now his career is stagnating a little bit over there in IndyCar. He didn't get the Andretti drive, of course, the Cadillac drive that some thought he might be looking for, and part of that was because lack of super license points. He's not denied the idea of coming to Formula 2 and giving it a go. Isaac Hadjar is a bit concerned about going to Red Bull and the implications of that, and you can see why with what Checo Perez is talking about yesterday. So there's a few interesting things with this confirmation. Bottas, Perez, that's your Cadillac lineup. They talk about that they're interested in having an American driver, but it just didn't work out. They just didn't feel like it was the right fit. They thought Bottas and Perez were the right men for the job. Now, what about the old car testing? This is a pretty funny one. I had not really thought about this much, but nowadays there's all this testing previous cars, TPC testing, get the mileage in. But if you're a new team, you got no previous cars, right? So what do? What is the protocol there? The protocol is you can actually borrow a car, and the article describes how likely Ferrari are going to loan Cadillac some of their former cars so they can actually run TPC tests with them. Now, this is kind of useful. It's funny in a way because obviously the older spec cars are not going to be relevant at all to the current spec cars, certainly for 2026 and beyond. The relevance really comes down to getting race ready, you know? Like most F1 teams have been on the grid a while. They understand how a race weekend works. They know the execution, right? Whereas for Cadillac, some of them anyway will be doing it all for the very first time. So the idea of doing some testing sessions with a car, understanding, okay, we're sending the lad out onto the track. We've got to do this. We've got to do that, right? We're going to call him in for a pit stop. What's the protocol there, right? These things that they've got to learn as they go. And Ferrari, it seems, are going to help them out with that for probably a bit of a chunk of change the other way around. Perez versus Bottas is going to be fascinating next year. Toto says that he thinks Valtteri has got plenty of offer still to Formula 1. And I think Valtteri Bottas made it very clear that he still wanted this type of opportunity, right? He stayed in F1 last year as Mercedes reserve driver, helping Kimi Antonelli. That was not so true for Sergio Perez, right? He took a hiatus, he took a break, but it worked out spectacularly. It's very rare to imagine a driver who stepped away from F1, didn't race at all, and their stock actually increased over the year. But that did basically happen to Perez because things at Red Bull went from bad when he was there to worse when he left. And I think as a result, it helped his status to some degree as well. So Perez had quite a few words to say and some strong ones at that, having officially confirmed that he's back on the grid. He said the following. I'll actually start with this quote. We'll come back to that one. It's a very unique car, very unique driving style that I managed to survive for many years, but it's difficult and it's the way that it works. And you've seen it with great drivers before my time or even after my time. So discussing his time at Red Bull, the struggles with the second car. Now, look, it is worth saying when Checo was at the team and was struggling at the end of 23 and certainly at the end of 2024, the car was a world championship winning car in the hands of Max. The car that Yuki and Liam did drive and Yuki's currently driving is not a car that's going to win the championship. Now, you might argue that Max was still capable of doing so if the McLaren wasn't an absolute rocket ship this year, but I think from top to bottom, the Red Bull is clearly a much weaker car this year than it was before, but I guess that's a matter of perspective and interpretation. Perez does say, I think that Yuki and Liam, they've scored like, 5 points or something like that? They've actually scored 7, but I'll discuss the new, it was only Yuki, right? But Lawson was only there a couple of rounds. So it's very, very difficult, very tricky, and they are fantastic drivers, but it's just the way that it is to drive it. Of course, it makes Perez sound even better, right? He's pretty tactical here. It's like, Yuki and Liam, great. Look, they are good drivers for sure. Are they fantastic drivers? Maybe not. But if Perez says, look, fantastic drivers struggling with that car, I must be the best, and then Max is simply an alien, I suppose is the logic there. You're losing confidence, but mentally I was super strong. And this I honestly do agree with Checo on, right? Like, I think given the circumstances, Perez did hold up pretty well. I think he had to make himself a bit delusional at times. Like, there were some times where Perez was often talking about, we and, the issues that we are facing and everything. And sometimes it was probably he'd just done a bad lap. But I think that mentally, Perez managed it quite well, because other drivers would have been broken quicker. And the fact that Perez, it's not like he was so in his head that he was like, oh yeah, at the end of 2024 it's a disaster, I just want to go. Like, he was surprised to get sacked. He thought he was going to stay. And maybe that was kind of delusional, because I think many of us realised he was getting fired long before it seemed like he did. But maybe that kind of mentality actually helped keep him more resilient to what was a challenging circumstance. So he says, that's why I survived there for so long. I had lots of pressure and a lot of you guys were on me, and now you realise the job that I've done in that car and in that team. So, criticising the media, right? Saying that, you guys were criticising me heavily, but now you realise that actually I did a pretty good job. There are a couple of ways to look at this. As I say, the car that Perez was driving was still tricky, but fundamentally had maybe a higher ceiling than the car that the guys are currently driving. But whatever the case is, Perez definitely looks better now because of what's continued to happen to that second seat than he previously did. And it's understandable that, having talked with Red Bull and elsewhere, that they're interested, Cadillac, in getting him in. So Perez went on to say a similar thing, not just because of the struggles of the current drivers or the next drivers that take the seat, but even before that, everyone forgets it's a tricky place to be. It's a mentally unique challenge. I don't think I have anything to prove. When you see the amount of points they've scored, it's something like 5. I've got nothing to prove in that regard. I'm coming back to enjoy the sport. I want to enjoy the sport that I love, the sport that has given me so much. I couldn't afford to leave the way that I left the sport. It's why I'm coming back with this project, and I hope it's a very successful one. Amongst that, other than everything, I want to enjoy the comeback. So I actually really like what Perez had to say here. Does he have something to prove? I would say that there's always something to prove in some respects. His opinion is that, well, he wasn't doing great at Red Bull, but they sacked him and they even got worse. So that kind of proves that he was right, or he was the right man for the job or something. I'm still not fully sure that's the case. I still think getting rid of Perez was justifiable in the circumstances, but they made plenty of other mistakes, Red Bull, leading up to what led them, let's say, to that decision. And there's always something to prove with respect to Bottas right on the other side. Like, if Perez turns up and gets annihilated by Bottas, then, it's not going to look good exactly. And there is some discussion from some as like, oh, well, he's just coming back to have a good time, right? Like, is he just here for the paycheck? But no, I think there's more to it than that, right? Perez loves F1. He, was a good driver for sure. Like, he had his stints where he was very impressive, and wanting to end on a high and go out on a good note, I think is commendable. And I think there's more to it than Perez just wanting to collect the bag. Like, I think he does want to come back and have something to prove, at least to himself. Maybe not from as far as he's concerned to Red Bull or anything quite like that. But yeah, Lawson and Yuki will just have to suck it up and say, well, now maybe Perez is right. Like, they've only scored a couple of points, so he's got nothing left to prove. And in many respects, Liam and Yuki, and mainly Red Bull and Pierre Wache, the technical design team, actually did his job for him. This, just to quickly look at, this is Yuki's whole career, actually. But if we just scroll over, you'll see these were his results last season. And this season so far, he had 12th place in China, 16th place or 12th place in Australia, 16th place in China. Now, he scored points in Bahrain. He scored 2 points in Bahrain for Red Bull. He scored 1 point in Miami for the main race, 1 point in the Imola Grand Prix in the main race. That was 4 points. Then he scored 3 more points in a sprint in Miami, where he came 6th. So that puts him up to 7. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just wanted to quickly mention this again if you guys are still confused on it, because I'm still a bit confused about it. Valtteri Bottas got a penalty in Abu Dhabi 2024. He couldn't serve it. He therefore got a 5-place grid pen for his next race, but he's not raced again. Now, that's over 12 months ago by the time he races again, and as a result, there is a new clause that's come into effect where any penalty over 12 months old expires, but that only applies from now on. So Bottas's penalty, we think, will still apply for Melbourne 2025. And I think for Cadillac's perspective, if that penalty matters, like if that penalty is going to be a painful one and they're actually taking like proper grid positions they're losing that's painful to experience, that's a massive win for Cadillac, I think, given the off-season that they are likely to have. But very much interested your thoughts in the comments. The Dutch Grand Prix Media Day tomorrow. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.